Hey everybody, my name is Dustin Siggins with Proven Media Solutions. And today we're going to talk about apologies in crisis. We have Drew, who was actually the person who suggested this, Dan, who is freezing up in Boston, and Lynda, who makes us all look bad by being so professional. And they all have different perspectives on crises. I'm a PR guy, I'm a PR flack, not a crisis expert. So I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation because in my background is in politics, apologies seem to be kind of going away because political crises seem to be people kind of realize now that the cottage industry of 10 years ago means that a lot of the trolls who yell at you probably aren't in your target audience, and there's always a next crisis 12 hours later, as evidenced by Astronomer, American Eagle, etc., not apologizing. But as Drew pointed out, companies are still doing a ton of apologizing, especially when it comes to more traditional crises. So I'll actually do the rare thing of not talking as much on this one and let everyone else kind of take over. So, Drew, Lynda, Dan, if you would like to sort of introduce yourselves as well as where we're going to come from your perspective on apologies.
I'll start, I guess. So I'm Drew Kerr. I'm running the Four Corners Group, and currently I am the senior communications. This is something I haven't even announced yet. The senior. Here we
Breaking
go.
news!
Breaking
Breaking news!
news.
Exclusive on my show.
Been going on for a month. It shows you how busy it's been. I'm the senior communications advisor for the Ton Foundation, which is a pretty substantial crypto company based in Switzerland. And all over the place. So I wake up 5 o'clock in the morning every morning. But nevertheless, uh, a longtime communications coach and crisis communications and prevention advisor in New York.
Okay.
Lynda Carlisle. I work and I'm a partner at CS Effect. We are an agency based in Chicago. Work with, for the last 20 plus years, I've been working with healthcare organizations, nonprofits, associations, for-profit companies on strategic communications. And a lot of that has to do with reputation management, which, Drew, to your point, we always try to work on issues management so that these things don't become crises. But yeah, it keeps me busy throughout the day, that's for sure.
And I'm Dan Ring. My background is in-house, so I deal with crises. I have dealt with crises over the years from an in-house perspective, although I did start out on the agency side. So I did a little bit of crisis comms on that front, but thrust into it over the last many years in-house. Dustin, back to you.
Yeah. Well, so Drew, by the way, anyone who's watching, please ask questions, bring comments. You'll see me looking down because I'm taking a nap because although I also did not sleep much last night, like Drew. It's because I'm looking down and make sure I can bring your comments into the conversation. So please do bring them in as quickly as possible. Um, Lynda, I'd actually like to throw to you first. You had mentioned in our prep call that there are certain types of crises where an apology must be brought out early. There's no even question about that. There's no discussion about that. Can you talk a bit about that, and then we'll throw to Drew to talk about apologies more broadly.
Absolutely. I think that there's, when there are children involved, when there are serious injuries or deaths, no matter who is to blame, there's certainly an apology and an acknowledgement that needs to come forward. And I do want to distinguish the difference between apologizing that something happened and accepting responsibility for something that happened. Those are two different things. Apologizing that a family has gone through an experience versus apologizing that you are responsible for that family's experience. Those are different. But if there is a situation where there's blatant involvement with the company, there's negligence, that does certainly increase the sense of urgency and timeliness for a response. I know during that prep call, we had talked about, kind of the wait and see approach, but that is superseded by the level of crises that you're going through, a company's going through.
And Drew, you're the one who brought the topic of apologies up to as the topic of the show. So I'd love you to take off of what Lynda talked about when you need to apologize and talk about it more broadly in terms of crisis communication strategy.
Well, I think the thing that sparked it was this period during the summer really kind of originated. I think it sort of rose to the surface during the summer, and Axios's communicators newsletter, I would say this was more clickbait than reality, but there's certainly a little bit of truth to this when they declared in its very clickbait fashion that the age of public apology is over. But we know that's not true. They did cite a few examples. Obviously, with American Eagle, the CEO never apologized. When CloudStrike had that huge issue for 24 hours when it went down, and at first it I would say they actually did a great job handling themselves, but at one point they hadn't apologized early on, and then they caught themselves and did. And so there was a lot of questioning about, I mean, I don't think we're out of this age of apologies, but I do think that it really comes down to what people are still expecting to hear when things go wrong. We understand that things go wrong. It happens as people, it happens as companies. Some companies are better than others at preventing them and acting upon them. But what I think we've seen is that people still want to hear it. It's very, very important. Even though there are still a few instances where there is a refusal to apologize. I'm seeing instances of delayed apologies, if anything, things that are just taking way too long to come in and apologize for. But I think that this is something that really needs to be addressed because people need to hear it. I think it's a basic human function to tie things up.
Dan, you had a bit of a perspective as the in-house person on, well, what is actually a crisis?
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk, LinkedIn about what is a crisis, who should do what. There's a lot of different opinions on astronomer. We talked about that on the show. Both of us thought it really wasn't a crisis at all. But I've had people argue it was an internal crisis for the company because how are employees going to think about it? I'd love to hear your take as the long time, in-house person here.
Yeah. And what I did, Drew brought up a really good point, just really quickly. Delays exacerbate situations. Um, that's evident and has been evident forever. From an internal comps perspective, this hat is a B2B hat. So it's not B2C.
The literal,
What'd you say? Sorry?
you work for North Face?
Well, no, it's not even a sponsor. They should, maybe they should be. That'd be great. Um, but I mean, from a B2B perspective, and really more broadly, let's say from a software perspective, software has issues. Issues impact customers. Customers have their customers, and so you're talking about your customer's customer as well. And so it's a domino effect, and it's a litany of issues. And so when you have this kind of issue, this crisis, there are a lot of people internally who are involved. So obviously the technical people, the developers, et cetera, product management, leadership, legal, sales, everyone involved with sales, those who are on the front line, account management, et cetera. And then of course you have the board, if there is a board. And I think most companies have boards. So there are a lot of stakeholders internally and externally. And at the end of the day, when there is this kind of crisis, you do want to have all of your information together. And once you have it together and you have this root cause analysis to figure out what happened, you know, you can then work on the apology. There might be a situation in which your company is not directly at fault. It's another company, and you work with them because all these companies are interconnected. But one of the things that we talked about earlier on the prep was that you have the external message, but then you also have the internal message. And Lynda brought that up, which was a great point. Everyone has to be on message because what can happen is that customers or prospects or even press. I don't think press are nefarious in this regard, but some might be. Not some, very few are. They're not necessarily going to reach out to the PR person. They're going to reach out to someone with whom they're connected for some kind of statement. And if not everyone is on message, that is going to escalate. That's going to lead to massive issues. And then, you're dealing with multiple crises. So I think consistent messaging, making sure it's controlled, making sure that everyone who knows about the crisis is looped in. Not everyone needs to know until or unless it becomes widespread. And that's important too.
Yeah, I think, Dan, when we were talking about that, oftentimes companies will overlook their internal audience. They think, well, they're the last ones who need to know, but they're oftentimes, if this is something that's already hit your public audience, then your staff certainly need to know. Employees are your most important ambassadors, and they're the ones who are talking to their friend that works, at United Airlines, and they want to know what's the story, what's going on. We've been talking about American Eagle, using them as an example. I think back to the United Airlines incident in 2017 and how that played out from 5 p.m. on a Sunday until Tuesday or Wednesday when the CEO finally made the appropriate apology.
Mm-hmm.
What
7 times. Took him 7 efforts.
PR person, that was just, get me the popcorn because I need to watch this play out and see what's going on. That to me was a full case study on what not to do. And I've heard Oscar Munoz talk about this, and he acknowledges that. Guy had a heart transplant, just shortly before that. So I'm sure that tested the waters a little bit for him. But the point is that the first apology that was sent out in that particular case was to the people in Louisville who had and just to refresh everyone's memory, this was the video that you can't get out of your mind of the physician being dragged down the aisle because he refused to give up his seat because they were overbooked. And there were 3 United Airlines employees who needed to get on that plane. So 2 other passengers gave up their seats, but Dr. Dow said, no, I need to get on this plane. Well, that wasn't okay with United Airlines. So they dragged him off the plane. You've got images of blood dripping down the seats. It was just a disaster. But the first apology that was sent was to the passengers who had a delay in their flight in Louisville. That was the first apology. And so when you look at the response time and then ultimately what that apology was first, wrong audience, wrong priority, wrong concern, which made it was just fuel to the fire because at this point things were blasted all over Twitter. Social media had gone, everything was a mess. Now, Monday morning, here comes another apology, which was too late at that point, a public apology. But at the same time, there was an internal memo that basically attacked the character of the passenger who had been dragged and injured. That memo, of course, got leaked as, it's another key learning. Anticipate everything is going to be public. Even if you don't intend it to be, it will become public. So that memo got leaked, which adding more fuel to the fire of, now you're blaming the victim. So the first official apology came out on Wednesday after the stock of United had fallen $1 billion. So even that apology, the authenticity and the drive behind that apology was already muted because it was clear why that one came out on Wednesday.
This actually brings up a very interesting point with airlines, because it makes me think about, if you think about industries and industries that are susceptible to crisis, airlines always seem to be the ones, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm curious to what you think, they always seem to be very susceptible to these very kinds of issues more than any other industry. Like there was that winter where Southwest was grounding their flight. They were having all these issues and, with the weather and everybody just wanted to strangle the CEO of Southwest. But it took the CEO of Southwest to get on national TV like a week to get on before he finally addressed what was happening. But other than the incredibly bad timing of the CEO, what is it about the airline industry where there always seems to be a crisis happening that doesn't seem to be a uniformity in how things are handled? And I've never seen an industry quite like it in that regard.
think a lot of that, Laura in the comments asked about the Verizon outage and the $20 card that was extended to people. I didn't follow that, so I would love to include that in our conversation in a few minutes. But I think companies like Verizon and airline companies, they face the public, and the public is going to put things on social media. They're going to send a video to a friend or a family member who's going to put it on Facebook. These things get spread like wildfire. And because of that, I think regulators pay a lot more attention. The Southwest issue was predictable because they didn't have the technology in place and the processes. But then they got, I forget the number, it was a massive fine. Even though it does seem like they did handle a lot of it appropriately with reimbursements and luggage, they still got targeted by regulators. So I think a lot of it is the fact that there's a heavily regulated industry that directly faces millions of people in the public.
But here's the thing, Verizon doesn't fly airplanes. Verizon at least acted quickly on that rebate, like very quickly. The
Sure.
thing about the airline industry is you've got flights, there's always people with cameras. There are many employees spread out all over the place, and there doesn't seem to be a uniformity on how to handle situations. Either there's not a uniformity or people forget them. There's many companies that have many, think about car companies and showrooms, and, there's many industries that have different kinds of, where it's spread out. And car companies like airlines are publicly traded. But why, the thing that bothers me about airlines is that doesn't seem to be a uniformity in handling situational crises and handling crises. I've never seen anything quite like it. And it never fails to subside. It almost seems like it's just a matter of time before the next one happens. Again, you don't see that at car dealerships. People have phones everywhere. Why don't they train people in a uniform way? Why isn't there a way to handle these things so that the bad press, where it might be anything from people being dragged, like that's just the epitome of a horrific crisis, to racial profiling and people waiting unnecessarily on flight, just seems to always happen. And I always wonder, why can't this industry handle their crises better? And apologize for them in the right way. It takes forever to do this.
I mean, the expectations among airline passengers are so low to begin with, which also doesn't help the airlines all that much because I don't know of anyone who has a rosy expectation among the airlines. I mean, you can have good experiences and bad experiences, but Drew, that's a great point.
Just to move on to a different area of apologies, because I know we've talked about the delays. My pet one of recent vintage is the PGA, and of course I have to bring up the PGA at the Ryder Cup, and it took the CEO, let me just to quickly sum up that situation. The Ryder Cup is annual battle between the US and UK golfers, and they take turns going to each other's location. Last year they were in the US, they were out in Long Island, and it attracted like the worst of the worst, screaming the most vile things to the UK golfers and their wives, just the most horrible things. And it took the head of the PGA a full week to apologize to the UK golfers, and he subsequently resigned. So, but the other thing I think that is worth discussing about apologies is what is said. And I find that a whole other art form and thing that needs to be addressed with apologies, because some of them are handled very, very well. When they eventually get to them, whether it's immediate or not, they say the right things. And then sometimes it always seems like they're trying to say that other people didn't get what they were trying to do, that it was a joke or whatever their program, they, in a very subtle way, they try to place the blame on like the public, like you didn't get it. and and then they have to sort of explain what it was they were trying to do. And I think that is a very bad way of, if you've gotten to the point of apologizing, you don't want to blame it on other people misunderstanding what you were trying to do. Lynda, you're shaking your head a lot. So you've got
Well,
to,
it's because, Drew, you're making me think about the I won't go back to the United Airlines example, but American Eagle, right? That
Mhm.
was their intent. I mean, just to cause all of the controversy. I have a hard time believing they did not anticipate the reaction that they got. That was all by design. I think that they may have had to make a decision on how they reacted to it. Maybe they didn't understand how strongly the opposition may have come forward. But, and I've seen various reports on sales, and I've seen various reports on feet in the store and what came to follow quickly after that campaign launched. But at the end of the day, they made a conscious decision not to apologize. And so I think that if you are to say, you know what, the blame is that was not my intent for you to understand it that way. My intention was for you to view our campaign as this. I don't even think they did that. They just let it roll. So so they didn't even put blame on the recipient. They just chose not to really respond and let the numbers talk for themselves. And I know that that was, I think, the largest campaign investment they've made. And it looks, they have no intention of turning back from there. So I there's also that conscious decision of if we don't, whether we say something or we just don't say anything at all. And I know, Dan, you brought that up in terms of, at what point can you just let a crisis play out a little bit and see what happens? You use we use a lot of listening tools like, Cision has one, Meltwater has one, looking at sentiment, looking at what are your audiences, your key audiences, what are they saying, what are the water cooler conversations around this particular incident. But at a certain point, you got to make that decision. Do we actually publicly say something, or do we let this die down and see, if we actually do need to step in?
So, Dan, I want to ask you a question. What I do want to get into, by the way, Drew brought this up a moment ago, and Lynda, you hinted at it as well, is how to make a proper apology. Avoid doing what Cracker Barrel did or Bud Light did, where you're either blaming or, in the case of Bud Light, their whole statement was essentially the CEO saying, "I'm a patriot and we love America," which has nothing to do with the controversy that arose. But Dan, is there a place when you're not issuing a public apology, but still issuing that internal memo to help the employees understand, like, we're not going to blame anybody. This thing happened, but we're going to have your back. It's not going to affect your job. Can you reassure employees, even if you're not issuing an apology?
Yeah,
Just
I
so
mean,
they know their back.
if it's controlled internally, then that's important because you don't want to draw attention to it if you don't have to. But it doesn't matter. Like the audience, if the audience is, if it's media, if it's a statement for press who have been reaching out, or if it's customers or prospects, partners, anyone internal, you want to own it. You want to be as transparent as is merited. You want to be concise. You want to be quick, and you want to show some compassion. To the other comments from Drew and Lynda, it's like compassion goes a long way. Um, Callousness doesn't, and that really negatively impacts everything. And so, show some compassion. So, show some sympathy. Um, that's important, but you want to be as quick as you can, and you want to be concise. You don't need to boil the ocean, to use a cliche, but you do want to make sure that you are clear with others. I mean, no one want. I mean, I shouldn't say no one want. Let me rephrase that. Burying things under the rug, someone's going to find it. Um, and so you don't want to do that, but you do want to be able to provide insights and just intel to folks so that they know what's going on because everyone needs to be looped in. If they're not looped in, if someone, once again, to Linda's point, let's say there's someone's friend at another company calls them up, who knows what they're going to say? If they say, I don't know what this is, I don't know what happened, that's not good. Or they could say something that is incorrect. That's not good. So both of those are demerits. You have to make sure that, those don't happen.
The thing where it really becomes tricky is when companies and brands try to do something that is edgy, you know, and and they say, oh, we tried to do something, certainly a popular watchword, a little bit of snarky, but edgy, I would say, is the word. And edgy is a very, very difficult thing to pull off because people perceive edgy in many, many different ways, the general public. Maybe a certain demographic gets it, but others may not. So when you're trying to walk that very fine line of doing a campaign or whatever at a launch or something, and you apply edginess to it, usually with humor, um, and it backfires. The worst thing, and this is why I think about the method of apology that, as you were explaining, Dan, is when somebody doesn't get edgy, when somebody doesn't get the joke, you do not want to, you have to be very, very careful that you are not going to be condescending in your apology. You can't say in a very subtle way, it's not our fault you didn't get it, or let's explain it. You're sort of being a bit condescending in your apology. And I've seen that far too many times where we thought you guys would get that this was the joke. And that is something you just do not want to do because you have this sort of holier than thou attitude in trying to explain. It is a bit condescending. You're kind of implying that they were dumb, that they didn't get your edgy joke, which might not have been funny in the first place, or might have been offensive to a lot of people in the first place. Be very, very careful when you play the edgy card because you have to be prepared that you're going to apologize. You probably will. And that in that apology, you can't be condescending. You can't explain the joke. That should not be part of the apology.
Well, the other thing, I mean, that's a great point. And what we've seen for the last 10-ish years is that there are certain execs, certain CEOs who can be accusatory when it comes to the public, accusing them of wokeness. And that, I mean, that's happened pretty regularly. I haven't done a search. I probably should have before saying it, but there are a lot of these spokespeople who will accuse the public of this wokeness, which certainly I think is completely foolish to do. I don't know, Linda, you were
Well, that was again going back to the American
yeah.
Eagle example. One thing that struck me, their CMO said something about, are we managing a crisis or optimizing an opportunity? And so sure, when you design a campaign like that, that's got to be part of the conversation. There was part of that, the reaction was certainly the woke community, that was being criticized, and that was part of the discussion. Absolutely. Now, when you start infusing the political side of a campaign for a jean jacket, that becomes an issue that now you're not controlling any of the narrative. Now that has just become an entirely different monster. But Dan, you had said something about showing compassion and how, of course, humans can relate to other humans. And so in any crisis where even if you're, extending an apology does not mean accepting responsibility. There are ways that you can certainly appeal to somebody's pain. You can, acknowledge horrific types of traumatic experiences without accepting blame or accepting responsibility for the cause of that. And I think that's something that a lot of companies overlook, and attorneys certainly. We've worked with so many attorneys that certainly don't want to release any sort of comment, which gives us PR folks heart attacks, because that's certainly the last thing we want to do is say no comment. So I do think that there's a level of this human approach that at the end of the day, when you're putting your head to pillow, are you happy with how your company has come across in a type of crisis that any human can relate to, you know? And I go to that side because I've worked with things from sexual abuse of children, CEOs being, you know, accused of sexual abuse or racial dismissal. And so there's a lot of emotions involved in that case, which then is a very different issue than maybe a software security company, you know, where there's a data breach. It's a very different scenario. But at the end of the day, I think we certainly do need to remind ourselves that we're all human, and that emotion in certain situations is going to prioritize any other type of response that's needed.
Real quick, everyone who's watching, please jump into the comments. We got about 10 minutes left, maybe 15. So we definitely want to hear any questions or experiences you have, any sort of case studies you want us to talk about. One thing I thought about, I again, not a crisis guy here, but in 2022, there was a bunch of shark attacks in New York along different beaches. And I don't remember, I'd have to look it up. I thought of it as you were talking, Lynda. I don't think they issued an apology, because it's not their fault that because of the warmer waters that there were a handful of sharks. It was, I think, 2 or 3 shark attacks over the span of like a 50-mile waterway in New York. But what they did do was say, we're closing the beach today. No one died. People got injured. No one died. We're going to close the beach. Tomorrow, when we reopen, we're going to have we're going to get there an hour early. We're going to have people paddling around. And they did all of these, I call it 5 or 6 steps to clarify what happened, bring out any good news, give concrete action, execute on the action, and then continue to communicate while they were executing the action. But there was no apology in there. From my perspective, again, my background being political, there's so many apologies. You know, of course, Verizon is going to go down every so often. I don't need to hear an apology. My phone didn't go down, but my colleagues did. I don't think I need to hear an apology. Just let me know if things are back up, and I'm going to forgive you pretty quickly. Does seem to me like there's a lot of apologizing. How important is it to have an action plan? If it's more than a holding statement, how important is it to have an action plan, including the apology, so it doesn't just look like a smarmy, you know, you just release the thing because you have to?
So really quickly, from a B2B perspective, every company I've been a part of and everyone I know in this vocation has scenario planning for every kind of scenario, and there's an action plan for every kind of scenario. You need that in place, and then obviously you need the buy-in from all the key stakeholders, legal, executive, etc. But you should that should be proactively done. You need to anticipate that well before, because shit happens. And that's critical. And if you don't have it, it means that you're running around on fire while you're dealing with unknowns. So you need to have that in place.
I mean, this is something I've talked about quite a bit. Dustin knows that all too well, is crisis prevention, and something that I mentioned early on, which is a lot of people don't think it will happen to them. Simple as that. You know, there was a client early last year, maybe about a year ago, when I said, you know, we talked about training, and I said, you know, communications training, and I said, you know, we should probably talk about crisis prevention, because you need to know what to say, and not just know what to say, but you need to make sure these things don't happen, because it's a lot more, it's far more costlier to fight a battle than, you know, to fight a battle than to stop it. And he said, but a crisis hasn't happened. I don't need to worry about that. But that's the point. You know, he did not understand. Um, a lot of companies, especially these days, because of layoffs or personnel or with that not having the foresight, crisis prevention and having a checks and balances system internally is just non-existent. And so they're basically chasing fires all the time as opposed to preventing fires. And that is just something that is not in the usual corporate mentality, is preventing these things. That there should be somebody, especially with social media, which to me is the most vulnerable part of any company, is what is being posted on social media, how's it being worded, who's the audience. Um, so many things happen or posted because the social media director either wasn't paying attention or maybe didn't construe it a certain way, and then it goes public and then it backfires and then they have to pull it off. So yeah, this is a whole area that still needs to be addressed, that are just not being paid attention to. You can have all the plans in the world, but if you're not doing something to stop it from happening in the first place, that's a problem.
I think preventing those fires, and also don't undervalue the amount of investment that you put in building trust in your brand before these crises even start. So understanding who your audiences are, what they're responding to, understanding their behaviors right away on social media, so that if something happens, you know how to mitigate that, you know how to connect with them right away. There's, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. There are many things that you can do through good PR, good strategic communications with your stakeholders, so that as you're putting those deposits into that account, something eventually will happen, but you'll have this good base to stand on, that once you do issue an apology, or you don't and you let things roll a little bit, you've got a solid ground to start on. So we encourage our clients to, make those investments before something happens, so that when you're getting to that point, you've got a solid ground.
Let me ask a question of my fellow panelists. If you don't mind, Dustin, there's a question, just circling back. But I just have a question. I really have, it's just like a question that was like, you know what, this is the perfect time to ask, since we're talking about apologies. And back in the Axios article that appeared at the end of last August said that one of the reasons that we've come to the end of the era of public apologies, and I do put that in quotation marks, is that people are tired of people being canceled, of cancellations, and the whole cycle of cancellation. So I'm very curious, Lynda and Dan and Dustin, you certainly can weigh in for sure. Do you think people are tired of that, of cancellations, and that's why of being canceled, and that's why we're not seeing, there's still a percentage of companies who are not rushing to apologize?
Well, I'd like to jump into that real quick if I can, because it brings me back to something Dan said about wokeism being brought into from certain CEOs and other business leaders. I was a political reporter a decade ago, 11 years ago, when it became sort of a cottage industry of apologizing. And it seemed to be more on the apologizing to those who were woke, when that term sort of became popular between Black Lives Matter movement. There was the big push in North Carolina on transgender issues. It became a sort of, to use the common political terms, more of a pro-liberal sort of political culture among corporations. That was talked about the Business Roundtable of changing, I think, from shareholders to stakeholders being the focus of companies. And then I think after the pandemic, there seemed to be a reverse of that long before, but people blame it on President Trump being elected and companies trying to suck up to the new administration. But even in mid 2023, it was the head of BlackRock, whose name is escaping me. He was a leader on ESG, and he said, "I'm changing my terminology here." This is long before President Trump won the election. I think there's been a realization that almost no matter what you say, you're going to offend somebody. So let's stop saying as many apologies because we're going to alienate somebody. Bud Light, Delta Airlines on voting reform. You're going to alienate somebody with an apology potentially if you're somehow involved in the political realm, either on purpose or by accident. So I do think that there was some backlash on that. But Drew, you brought the example of Hilton Hotels and the ICE factor that happened recently. So I think actually perhaps there is a bit more swing to the other way now. The pendulum has swung from being careful about people who are more liberal and maybe more careful about people who are more conservative because of the administration and the impact and then the volume of the president's voice on these issues.
So on the subject of cancel culture, and I don't know, this is this is me being partially subjective, but also being an avid reader of news. It seems like there's less concern about cancel culture than there once was. And if that's the case, that can perhaps um, allow for fewer. I still think that, if you or an organization has done something to piss off customers, intentionally or unintentionally, um, I think it's in your best interest to acknowledge it uh, and to address how you're going to correct it and to have some kind of apology. I mean, more than an acknowledgement, it's like, hey, we messed up. It's like you have every time there's a professional athlete who has an issue, um, the male professional athletes in this case, a lot of them say, you know, I'm a man and I'm going to man up, but they don't say anything else. Sometimes they might say, I apologize if. They never say, I apologize for. And I mean, I posted on this once. Dustin and I might have had a conversation on this. That drives me crazy when they say, I apologize if I've done something. Well, you've done something. So please don't use if because you're not owning it. I mean, I would personally cancel anyone who says if. But I think from a cancel culture perspective, it seems like it's less prevalent now. And I don't know if Lynda has thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that we've crossed the threshold for disingenuous apologies, and I feel like that's what's happened even 4 or 5 years ago, where CEOs were participating in conversations that they really didn't need to be involved in just to be part of the conversation, which then diluted the efficacy of anything meaningful that they might have to say or need to say. So I'm not sure if that how much of that is part of the equation, and what we're seeing now is that there's been maybe a step taken back to be more strategic about what conversations they are participating in and what they are feeling like, okay, we actually need to say something here and we have to be present versus, you know what, this is not really any of our business unless they've been, of course, Dan, to your point, directly involved with it.
I'm going to jump in real quick. We just have about 5 minutes left. I, I think that's a phenomenal point, Linda, and that's kind of I've been mulling this over because of my political background about cancel culture and related factors, and I think you've hit the nail on the head. The disingenuous factor, Target goes one way a decade ago, makes shifts over the years. They're the prime example, of course, versus Costco. Really hasn't said much. They had a shareholder vote, they said a statement, and they moved on with their lives. Trader Joe's didn't say much at the heart of 2020. They got national coverage because of the names of their products, and they said, we rely on customers, not random polling, random surveys by non-customers. I think you've hit the nail on the head. By stepping back by avoiding self-inflicted injury, you have fewer needs for apologies because there are fewer crises. And then when an apology is needed, it comes across as more legitimate and sincere. I think you've hit the nail on the head here.
She's right. She's right. Because, if you remember when the conflict happened in Gaza, when it broke out on October 6th, like anybody who's opening their mouth about any brand was immediately receiving like vicious backlash. And employees were wondering, why aren't you making a stand? Why aren't you making a stand? And those who said something got in huge, huge trouble. And the ones who kept quiet resisted what their employees, you need to stand up, you need to say something, and then they weathered the storm. So since then, companies have learned by looking at stores who took a stand. Now it's a different story. The zeitgeist has changed tremendously since that time. But there's nothing wrong with being quiet. I wrote an article about Fast Company, right? The three laws of shutting up. I actually recently learned a great saying. I don't know why I never heard this saying. That said, a wise man once said nothing. Why did he say nothing? Because he's a wise man.
It was that on my LinkedIn page.
There you go.
Yes,
I
you
put
did.
it on your LinkedIn page for a reason, because it's very applicable, whether you see that as sad or realistic, to be honest with you. I mean, I see this as realistic. Sometimes the best thing to do is to shut up. And it just is. It just is. There is an outrage cycle. I think it still exists. I think some people are tired of it. I don't know where you guys feel about that. And I think that's part of the reason why people sometimes are reluctant to jump into the apology thing. Um, Things evolve, as we've seen. The paradigm shifts constantly.
Well, let's end on a quick what is it called? Round robin. Dan Schulman posted in government, which is his experience, that the closer you get to actual responsibility, the harder it was to convince leadership that a public apology was the right course of action. Many of them leaders are the ones who were responsible. To your point, Lynda, about the CEO of United Airlines, I think it took him 7 efforts to finally get the right apology out there. So just round robin here to round this out is how do you, and let's say the crisis is starting to erupt, what is the best way to get a leader who may be close to the crisis, either caused by them or someone close to them, to understand like you have to get out there even if it hurts your personal brand? It's better for the organization. How do you address that in sort of strategic or even maybe in the negotiation style that you use?
Well, once again, from a B2B perspective, and my apologies for saying that ad nauseum. Um, you have, whether you're a private company or a public company, um, you have a risk of attrition. Even if your product or products are sticky, um, you do something that's going to infuriate or alienate or piss off a customer, um, they're going to go. They're going to go to a competitor. Um, so that impacts shareholder value. That impacts a lot. It impacts revenue. And I think that, most CEOs my hope is that all CEOs understand that. Every CEO I've worked with or for understands that. And so, they make a very conscious effort, but that's important. If someone doesn't recognize that or realize that, that's when it's going to be a massive issue, at least in my world.
I would say that obviously there's a lot of tools to monitor what the conversation is surrounding that I would take to that leader. And so that leader can make an informed decision, not just based on what my gut is telling me and what my experience is telling me, but presenting facts and data to support those recommendations is always helpful. Also understanding how expensive it is, Dan, to your point, to regain a customer versus to keep an existing customer, and what's the price tag on that. And companies, if you're going through a crisis and it's managed well, you got about a 70% chance of maintaining the trust in that customer. So that to me is worth a very important thought process behind how to respond.
If if there's a situation that I think that everybody should watch right now, and it's something that I wrote about on LinkedIn today and monitor, and that is what is going on with the Bilt credit card and its revamp. Um, it has become probably the most ill-conceived financial product rollout, or I should say revision, that I can remember in years. And this is going to be a very instructional case as to when something goes wrong very fast and how they handle it. And this situation is not over yet, which is why I think everybody should be watching it. This is a credit card that offered a way to pay rent without penalties and getting travel points at the same time for the last 3 years. And they just revamped their card and they took away that, they kind of made a more of a far more complicated way to get the rent for free and get points. And the backlash was explosive, so much the New York Times wrote about it. They made it so complicated, their new version of the card, that within 24 hours, the CEO went on again and issued a quick apology and said, we revamped our system, how's this? And it was basically like putting lipstick on a pig. It was almost no discernible difference in what they did with the credit card. This situation is literally going on right now. And I think that we are watching people who are either going to abandon this credit card in droves and go to other credit cards, or somehow they're going to have to figure out a way to keep them on. But this is something that I think merits watching right now as far as apologies, changing your brand, and what a CEO is doing. It is a very, very tough situation, but worth watching.
And I think it goes back to disingenuous apologies, because if you have real action attached to it, then even if your apology isn't perfect, people can say there's accountability and there will be change. Versus, as you said, Drew, lipstick on a pig. And I did post your post, but below this discussion, so people can see your analysis, Drew. I've got to wrap up here. I apologize. I hope Dan's warm enough. I know he walked right in out of the Boston weather today. What, 5 below, Dan? Something like that?
Yeah.
Chilly. But this was a great pleasure, folks. I really enjoyed it. I haven't thought this much about apologies outside of the political space ever. So this was highly educational. And Lynda, it was nice to meet you today. Thank you very much. So folks, listen, have a good day. Everyone stay warm. It's supposed to be warm tomorrow before getting really cold again. So try to get outside tomorrow. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks, Dustin.